Vice President Harris addressed her supporters directly last night as her campaign team had their first public discussion about where they might have fallen short in the 2024 race. Here was senior campaign advisor David Plouffe on the Pod Save America podcast.
I'm naive in this way. I just thought at the end of the day, particularly because Trump did not close well, I thought Kamala Harris closed well. Trump was reminding people some of the things they don't like about him, that might give us what we needed. But at the end of the day, I think the political atmosphere, the desire for change, all those fundamentals that you've spent a lot of time talking about really presented huge challenges for us. So, we got there, but we didn't get the breaks we needed on Election Day.
Joining us now, the 19th editor-at-large, Aaron Haynes, and chief strategist for the Bush-Cheney 2004 presidential campaign, Matthew Dowd. Both Aaron and Matthew are MSNBC political contributors. Still with us is Mark Leibovich. All right, Aaron, I'm going to begin with you. What do you make of what David Plouffe told the Pod Save America guys?
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly a very interesting kind of post-mortem, right? I think that podcast was something like an hour and a half of them just kind of revisiting what happened. Look, I mean, I think I certainly wrote in my column for the 19th at one point that 107 days, I think that was the only way that we were going to get Vice President Kamala Harris as a candidate, but was 107 days enough for her to win over the American electorate? And I think the answer is no. And I mean, obviously the answer is no, but I think that's also kind of where that campaign team landed. But, I think also, reflecting on where we are as a democracy on the other side of this election is absolutely a useful exercise. But I think what's also useful is to remind ourselves of who we say we are as a country. And, are we still a country that's committed to this idea of multicultural, multiracial, multi-gender democracy? And what does it mean if we aren't? Like, I was listening to this podcast and kind of reading some of the other kind of post-mortem assessments of 2024 that kind of suggest this strategy going forward that abandons identity politics. And that was the thing that I found most interesting kind of from this conversation and others like it, because it's not as if Donald Trump's entire strategy was not based on identity politics, right, Katie? I mean, MAGA is an identity. It's one based on white grievance around issues from the economy to education to immigration. And so this was not really about Democrats or Kamala Harris losing. The other side simply had the better identity politics strategy. So I think on the other side of this, thinking about who the voters are as opposed to who either of these candidates are and who had the better campaign is the question that we need to be asking ourselves now.
One of the arguments is not totally that it's identity politics' fault, but it's that the Democrats focused on the wrong identities. Instead of focusing on the differences between people on their socioeconomic levels, they focused on people of different races, but ultimately all those people, or the majority of them, were college educated and they lived in cities. They were of a certain class and didn't go to the people of the other class, the lower socioeconomic class, who were struggling more. And that's what Donald Trump was able to do effectively, to peel off a number of those voters who had long seen black and brown and white voters, who had long seen the Democratic Party as their ancestral home.
Yeah, I mean, look, I certainly take that point, but also, kind of weaponizing immigration, especially kind of in the home stretch in a way that did appeal certainly to the white voters that he already had, but also interestingly, to your point, that was a message that resonated with some black and brown voters, particularly black men, Latino men were open to his message on things like immigration. And that was also a message that was tied to the economy, which we know is the number one issue for all voters. And so, I think as we continue to kind of process how and why this happened, unpacking what the role of identity politics in all of this feels very important to do in this moment. And I think the other thing we have to acknowledge is the thing that we don't or can't or haven't yet figured out how to poll for, and that is what it will take for this country to elect a woman. I mean, like specifically what it means for the American electorate to believe that a woman is the most qualified person to lead on issues, whether that's the economy or foreign policy. Whether we associate the qualities that we associate with the president with women, like strength or, authority or a commanding presence or trustworthiness, like for the second time in
Yeah.
our history, Donald Trump, has beat the woman that was running against him. People saw him as the person that was the more, the candidate that they preferred. So there are complicated answers for how that happened. But what we should be asking ourselves why and what role gender, which was absolutely on display in this election, played in the outcome.
Yeah, I think you're right to ask that question and to see how much of a role it did play. I wonder, though, if this, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, Matthew, if this is more of a Democratic Party problem, the Democratic Party not necessarily having an identity in itself, or not being well enough defined for the public as a change vehicle.
I mean, here's how I look at this election. And I think oftentimes myths develop in the aftermath of an election that aren't based in data and aren't based in actually what happened in the course of this. I think we can't talk about this election. And I noticed on this podcast, which I listened to part of, that the elephant in the room or the donkey in the room that was never mentioned was Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. And Joe Biden's job approval rating on election day was 40%. And the normal election outcome of somebody with a 40% approval rating for their vice president is to get 40 or 41% of the vote. The vice president got 48% of the vote in this election. And I think that reading this one election is somehow an examination of so many other things other than the most important factor on election day in every state and in every demographic group was Joe Biden's job approval rating. That's what drove the vote cast more than anything else in here. And I would remind all of us and your listeners and viewers, 2 years ago, the Democrats did exceedingly well in all these states, and they elected women across the board for governor, for Senate, not only in 2022, but in 2024 simultaneously, where the vice president was losing in this. And so I think overreading this in too many other avenues, take the Democrats, I think here's what's happening. Both the Democrats and the Republicans are misreading the results of the election. The Democrats are misreading it, thinking they have to somehow abandon all these things and sort of completely reformulate their party, when I believe that isn't true. They have to make adjustments. They have to make changes. They have to do certain things. But basically, they just won a series of elections in 2022. And the Republicans are misreading this election, thinking they won because of Donald Trump. They won in spite of Donald Trump this year. Donald Trump underperformed by 7 or 8 points in this election, in a normal election with a job approval like Joe Biden. And that's what I think we have to start with. And then we can talk about all the other stuff.
Mark, what do you think of that?
I think, I agree. I mean, first of all, a couple of bottom lines here. I mean, one, it was basically a 50-50 race. And, Hillary Clinton had a 50-50 race. She won the popular vote. I think a couple things. I think Kamala Harris was a good candidate. I don't think she was a great president. It was not a great candidate. And I think one of the reasons for this is because Joe Biden put her in a terrible position, and also because he himself is unpopular, and inflation and immigration and all the issues that sort of weighed him down. And I think the other part of this is Donald Trump. I kind of agree with Matthew in that, yes, he kind of underperformed to some degree given Biden's approval. But look, Trump is a turnout machine. I mean, he overperformed in 2016. He overperformed certainly his polls in 2020. And it seems like he overperformed his polls maybe a tiny bit in this case. And Republicans have proven time and time again, when Donald Trump is not on the ballot, they underperform seriously. So in a few years, it's likely that there will be a new Democratic candidate, perhaps not someone we're even talking about now in the way that Barack Obama was not someone anyone talked about in 2004, 2005 as a potential 2008 nominee. And Donald Trump will not be on the ballot. And Republicans are not going to have that turnout magic that he has, proven to be in ownership of for 3 straight elections, and that will be winding down, and we'll be in another chapter. So again, 50-50. I think that's going to be true going forward.
Democrats have 2 years to try to find that next generation and get them ready for the election cycle, which again just begins in 2 years' time.